We've no less taste to sing God's praise than when we first begun. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me, and like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me, and like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we are continuing on with the 10th Psalm, and if you've already kind of looked ahead a bit, two things may have stood out to you regarding this. Well, one of them, at least if you have a Bible version that has the superscripts, as we've been looking at them, you may have noticed that this psalm doesn't have one. And also, if you read through it, you may have picked up on something that's a bit different from what we've seen up to this point. So a lot of scholars, a lot of commentators are of the opinion that Psalm 9 and 10 go together, that really it's one psalm that's been divided into two. It seems to be a rather popular opinion here. Brother Wakehaster's commentary, he says, some have suggested the 9th and 10th Psalms belong together, but such a conclusion seems forced at best. I'm not entirely sure I agree. I mean, it's just reading through them. It makes sense to me. In the Jewish Study Bible, which I sometimes like to look to for references and thoughts as well, they take it as a given, right? It's not even mentioned there's a possibility. It just flat out says, yes, these two go together. And they specifically cited 9:19 and 10:12, where you have very similar language used, particularly the phrase, arise, O Lord. And so you get a bit of that. That repetition, sometimes a lot of writings you'll have that. The book of Amos in particular comes to mind in that regard, but a number of the prophets' writings are like that, where you'll have these particular phrases that you see used time and again. And so, they cite that as a reason that 9 and 10 go together. Also the fact that there's no superscript for 10, while there is for 9, would certainly help to make that case. It could be a reason why. So that's one thing you may have noticed already, that there's no superscript, and perhaps that helps to maybe at least give some possible reason as to why. The other thing that you may have noticed, so if you're reading through this psalm is particularly concerned about the poor, which we haven't seen up to this point. If you're just kind of reading it on the surface, it sounds like some of the other psalms we've already seen, where you have the psalmist crying out to God because of the wicked. You have a little bit of that imprecatory flavor that we've noted before, calling for God's justice to be visited upon the wicked. But this psalm in particular really, really hones in on the poor. And that's interesting, because if you read through the New Testament in general, kind of one of those big, high-level thematic things that you may not notice unless you're really looking for it, but once you see it, you can't help but notice it. You have in the literary prophets, and I say literary prophets because in the Old Testament you have what are generally called the non-literary prophets, Elijah and Elisha being, the two the two most prevalent. And they're called that because we read about them in the historical books of the Old Testament, but they didn't write books themselves, right? There's no, we don't have a book of Elijah or a book of Elisha. We have, the history of them recorded by someone else. Versus literary prophets, and we actually have, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so forth. The actual books that contain their words, their writings. The literary prophets are particularly interested in the plight of the poor and a lot of the destruction that's being visited upon the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, depending upon which of those prophets you're reading, because they all, they're writing in different times. They're all writing in periods of crisis, interestingly, but different crises, whether it's Assyria or Babylon or even later than that, you have post-exilic prophets. They have tremendous concern for the poor, and also it's a big reason for the destruction. And there are others. Idol worship is also particularly prevalent. The king's failure to keep the covenant with God, but it's a major thing there. And it's the first time we're coming across it in Psalms. In Psalm 9:18, and again, part of the reason that it makes sense to me that 9 and 10 go together, besides the repetitive language, besides the superscript in 9, the lack of 1 and 10, we actually have in 9:18, for the needy shall not always be forgotten, the expectation of the poor shall not perish forever. It's actually the first time in Psalms the word poor appears there in 9:18, and then that same word shows up 6 times in Psalm 10. So again, and I don't know, maybe you're listening to this particular podcast, and you're thinking, well, I didn't really notice that. It jumped out at me when I was preparing for the recording today and going back through Psalm 10 in particular. It immediately caught my attention. I thought, wow, we haven't seen this up to this point. So anyway, Psalm 10, we'll read through, look at the outline, and then go back and make some other observations. Again, kind of keep in mind as we're reading through this, that idea that really 9 and 10 are two parts of a whole, right? Kind of like Luke and Acts, or Genesis and Exodus, two other examples of things that really kind of go together. If that's the case, then as we're reading 10, it's really a continuation of 9. Maybe not. Why standest thou afar off, O Lord? Why hidest thou thyself in times of trouble? The wicked in his pride doth persecute the poor. Let them be taken in the devices that they have imagined. For the wicked boasteth of his heart's desire, and blesseth the covetous, whom the Lord abhorreth. The wicked, through the pride of his countenance, will not seek after God, and God is not in his thoughts. His ways are always grievous. Thy judgments are far above out of his sight. As for all his enemies, he puffeth at them. He hath said in his heart, I shall not be moved, for I shall never be in adversity. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and fraud. Under his tongue is mischief and vanity. He sitteth in the lurking places of the villages, and the secret places doth he murder the innocent. His eyes are privily set against the poor. He lieth in wait secretly as a lion in his den. He lieth in wait to catch the poor. He doth catch the poor when he draweth them into his net. He croucheth and humbleth himself, that the poor may fall by his strong ones. He hath said in his heart, God hath forgotten. He hideth his face. He will never see it. Arise, O Lord, O God, lift up thine hand. Forget not the humble. Wherefore doth the wicked condemn God? He hath said in his heart, thou wilt not require it. Thou hast seen it, for thou beholdest mischief and spite to requite it with thy hand. The poor committeth himself unto thee. Thou art the helper of the fatherless. Break thou the arm of the wicked and the evil man. Seek out his wickedness till thou find none. The Lord is king forever and ever. The heathen are perished out of his land. Lord, thou hast heard the desire of the humble. Thou wilt prepare their heart. Thou wilt cause thine ear to hear, to judge the fatherless and the oppressed, that the man of the earth may no more oppress. Okay, so just reading through, hopefully you kind of picked up there a bit on what I meant when I said the plight of the poor really stands out here. like I mentioned, some of the Psalms we've looked at already, you have this similar kind of a feel, right? The psalmist is making this plea to God. You get the sense of, he wants justice and deliverance. There are the wicked that are out there. But generally it's been the psalmist's plight, right? You get the sense of there are enemies out there. Yes, they're wicked. Yes, they're unjust. But you don't necessarily pick up so much on what you do here that it's the oppressor and the oppressed. In fact, we have those specific words here. You have the oppressed, the poor, the humble, the innocent that are murdered in secret places, the fatherless. It really is the first time we're seeing this in Psalms. And also there's, like I said, the bit of the imprecatory thought. Verse 15, break thou the arm of the wicked, seek out his wickedness till thou find none. Right, so those pleas for justice that sometimes take on a rather violent or graphic bent. Okay, so there's also one more thing I'll kind of note just on this initial read through. Verse 16, the Lord is king forever and ever, the heathen are perished out of his land. Sometimes when you, with the Old Testament, you get questions, you get debates about authorship and, who wrote a particular book, when was it written? And it's especially interesting with Psalms because, again, the superscripts are added later. They're not original. And you have a collection, right? In fact, as we come, I believe it's Psalm 90, if I'm not mistaken. It's going to be a while till we get there. But you even have some Psalms attributed to Moses, so they go way back. And with Psalms, they're kind of all over the place. Each individual Psalm usually is its own composition, and they've been gathered together into this collection. So when you get into questions writing the superscript, and you wonder, why would some people say maybe this one shouldn't be attributed to David, right? Because sometimes they certainly make sense. I could easily, and I didn't necessarily come across this, but as I was reviewing for Psalm 10 in particular, but you run into these things like the multiple references to the poor, right? Is that it doesn't typically seem to be something you think of with David's rule. Not to say the poor have always been oppressed in some sense by someone somewhere. You've got some poor tenant living in an apartment building. There's some some owner who's willing to charge him more rent than perhaps he should. That kind of thing is certainly nothing new. But on a widespread basis, you find it in Jeremiah, you find it in Amos. Again, you find it in those prophets. They have major concerns about it. You don't tend to think of that so much as a widespread problem in David's time. So that's one thing. But then the other, in verse 16, the heathen are perished out of his land, right? The nations, some translations put it, non-Jews. And I suppose if you're going back to David's day, you could think of some of the native, the native Canaanites who were supposed to have been wiped out during the conquest, and they weren't. And then they stuck around and caused problems for many, many years to come for the Israelites. But again, some might look at that and say, well, that sounds more like someone writing later, thinking of Assyrians, Babylonians, even Persians. So I don't know, just kind of a note there to say, well, why do people ask questions like this? Well, these are some of the reasons why. You think, well, that doesn't necessarily fit so much with David. But whatever. Again, as I say with the superscripts, they're somewhat traditional to start with. Not somewhat traditional, completely traditional. But anyway, in this psalm, you kind of break it down. We have in the very first verse, again, keeping in mind maybe the 21st verse, a call on the part of the psalmist for God to deliver the poor and persecuted people. Again, for the 50th time, just since we started recording, not so much about the psalmist here as it is about others who are being oppressed. 2 to 11, a description of the wicked, the things that they do. Again, sitting in lurking places, murdering the innocent in secret places, setting his eyes privily against the poor, lying in wait to catch the poor, drawing them into his net, crouching, humbling himself. Again, that same emphasis. So we have the description. Verse 12, another call for God to intervene. Arise, O Lord, which again, language that harkens back to Psalm 9. The fact that God's eye clearly beholds the cruel deeds of the wicked. So verses 13 to 15, right? The wicked assumes, God isn't there, God isn't watching, God doesn't know. But he does. And then the last couple of verses, 16 through 18, the poor and the oppressed will be vindicated. All right, so there's confidence that, regardless of what's happening now, the poor will see the justice that the psalmist is calling for. So starting off with, this complaint, right, regarding these enemies. One thing that's interesting, here at the outset, verse 1, why standest thou afar off, O Lord? Why hidest thou thyself in times of trouble? Yet again, just to my own ears, it doesn't necessarily sound like the kind of thing that you would hear in other psalms. And I have it, in fact, here in Brother Wakester's commentary, it's in all caps. It says to the psalmist, it seems as if God were in hiding, as if he were far off. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, to me, it almost sounds a bit more like what you find in Habakkuk, right? Habakkuk famously noting the wickedness of the people of his own day and crying out to God. Essentially, God, when are you going to step in and do something about this, right? And he gets his answer, right? That answer boils down to, I'm getting ready to do something about it, and it's going to come in the form of Nebuchadnezzar riding roughshod over the whole country and taking care of all this. And Habakkuk is essentially told the same thing that Job is, which is, mind your place, right? You're not in a position to be making such demands. But as I'm reading this, and you may disagree, but here in this very first verse, I almost get the same kind of sentiment that one gets with Habakkuk, right? God, terrible things are happening. Why aren't you stepping in to do something about it? Now again, that's offset somewhat by where the psalm ends, right? So maybe Brother Wakester is right, because it ends on a note of confidence. But the poor are they're being oppressed, they're being murdered, they're being caught up in these snares. Something needs to be done about it. The wicked boast, right? The wicked boast of the wicked things that they've done. So there's certainly notes here regarding the pridefulness of it. Verse 3: the wicked boasteth of his heart's desire, and blessed the covetousness whom the Lord abhorreth. The wicked, through the pride of his countenance, will not seek after God. God is not at all in his thoughts, right? He thinks he knows best, right? He couldn't care less. And again, tying it back to what with the question asked in the very first verse, and all of the observations that follow regarding the plight of the poor at this wicked one's hands. Why wouldn't they think that, right? Things seem to be going their way. They seem to be getting whatever they want. Someone gets in their way, they kill them. They see an opportunity to take advantage of them financially, they do it. Why not? Again, to the psalmist's point, it would seem to be the case that the Lord is hiding himself in times of trouble and standing afar off. So the wicked is prideful. The fact that he will not require it means that the wicked is not willing to acknowledge the will of God, right? He doesn't think that the commandments of God apply to him, and so in effect he thinks God is not going to require an answer for his actions, right? he presumes that he's going to do whatever he wants and he's going to get away with it. In addition, to the wicked person, God's judgments are far above, out of his sight, right? He doesn't see them, right? I mean, he's so busy doing what it is that he wants to do. He's focused on his own desires, getting his own way. And he doesn't look up. He doesn't. It's out of sight, out of mind, right? The judgments being far above, out of his sight. I mean, we might put it's, I guess, perhaps in a more literal sense to him, right? It simply isn't there, right? He's going about in his prideful way, doing whatever he wants. And verse 6, he has said in his heart, I shall not be moved. I shall never be in adversity, right? What does he care? It isn't going to come back to bother him. And that's sadly the way that many lead their lives. And as a result of this attitude, this pridefulness, this lack of concern for God's will or for God's judgment, his mouth is full of cursing, deceit, and fraud, a tongue full of mischief and vanity, lurking places in the villages, slaying the innocent in secret places, his eyes set privily upon poor. Again, this constant refrain of the wicked taking advantage of the defenseless, poor, the fatherless, the humble, as we have it put in some of the other verses here. And again, I can't help but note very different concern from what we've seen in some of the other Psalms. Okay, so let's see, verse 12, the psalmist calls again upon God to do something about this. Again, just as we had seen back in Psalm 9, the very same language, Psalm 9:19. Arise, O Lord, let not man prevail. Let the heathen be judged in thy sight. 10:12, arise, O Lord, O God, lift up thine hand, forget not the humble. Wherefore doth the wicked condemn God? He has said in his heart, thou wilt not require it, and thou hast seen it. For thou beholdest mischief and spite, to requite it with thy hand. The poor committeth himself unto thee, thou art the father of the fatherless. So, after this initial question posed by the psalmist, why standest thou afar off, O Lord? Why hidest thou thyself in times of trouble? Again, regardless of how that sounds, again, to me, a bit like Habakkuk. Maybe not, because we have this statement here in verse 14, right? God does see it. He may seem to be standing afar off. He may be standing afar off, right? I mean, I kind of go back and forth on that thought. It may be, these terrible things are happening and God isn't intervening, right? He isn't doing it, because that's Habakkuk's play, right? There seems to be a situation, all these wicked things are happening, God ought to be doing something about it, or at least Habakkuk thinks God ought to be doing something about it. He isn't. Yet, just as God answered Habakkuk, the psalmist understands God does see. God beholds mischief and spite. He will requite it with his hand. In other words, God is going to have a say about it in the final analysis. And why? The poor committeth himself unto thee, thou art the helper of the fatherless. They will be requited. Justice will be done. In verse 15, we have that imprecatory note, break thou the arm of the wicked and the evil man, seek out his wickedness till thou find none. And I don't know that he necessarily means literally breaking an arm. I think he means, break, in the sense of the wicked one is out there doing whatever he pleases. He seems to have all the power. He seems to have the upper hand, as it were. Stop that, break it. But certainly, this idea of breaking. I mean, there are some psalms where you'll read a line. It'll say something like, break their teeth in their mouth. That's a rather graphic, rather violent thought. So it could be. Maybe he does mean this more literally than I think, but I think it's more of a metaphorical sense, right? Step in and stop it, right? Stop what this wicked person is doing, intervene, help the poor, the fatherless, the humble that are being so poorly treated. Again, the Lord is king forever and ever. The heathen are perished out of his land. We talked about that. I suspect that what's meant there has to do with the early enemies of Israel who were there. I don't think it goes later than that. But again, it is an interesting phrase to find there. Lord, thou hast heard the desire of the humble. Thou wilt prepare their heart. Thou wilt cause thine ear to hear, to judge the fatherless and the oppressed, that the man of the earth may no more oppress. Again, at the end of the day, God will come out on top, not the wicked oppressors. And yet again, I will point out, I don't know how many times we've seen this, I haven't been keeping track, but we're only on the 10th Psalm. And yet again, there's this clear notion that there are people who are wicked, and there are other people who are not so very wicked. Thou hast heard the desire of the humble. Decent people who, despite being certainly imperfect, are nonetheless, there's a clear contrast drawn between them and the wicked. They're somewhat flying in the face of that notion that everyone is a totally wicked, corrupt, black-hearted sinner from the time they leave the womb. The Old Testament at least disagrees. So does the New. You're willing to read it with that kind of an ideological bent. But anyway, so a couple of lessons to take from this one. The commentary is a bit sparse on them for this one, but he does talk here about the pride of the wicked, and I would agree, that's certainly one thing you learn from this psalm. Going back close to the beginning of it, if you go back to verses 3 and 4 in particular, this sense of pride that people have, thinking, I'm going to do things my way, I don't care what God thinks. Either it doesn't apply to me, or I don't care because I'm going to get away with it anyway. This psalm certainly has something to say to that. And also, I would add to that this sentiment that you find in, and I think particularly the gospel accounts in the New Testament remind me of it. Christ's own life and the concern that he had for the poor and oppressed. That one thing you find throughout Scripture is that God is particularly concerned about justice on behalf of those who are powerless to do anything about it here in this life. The downtrodden, the poor, the oppressed. Again, the literary prophets, those for whom we have those books in the Old Testament. It is a recurring theme, and part of the reason that they give, if not the predominant reason, for the destruction that's about to fall, first the north and then later the southern kingdoms. God has concern for them, and so ought we too. All right, so that is the 10th Psalm. Again, possibly the 9th and the 10th, if you put them together. But anyway, Lord willing, we will circle back next week to Psalm 11. Thank you very much for your attention today.
Over all the earth you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky. But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Over every thought, over every word, may my life reflect the beauty of my Lord. 'Cause you mean more to me than any earthly thing. So won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? You are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in